This is Duke University.
You were well acquainted with Duke from a young age. Your father was the chair of the math department and you grew up in Durham. Yeah. What do you remember about Duke during your childhood?
Well, I went through several periods because we moved, and of course I was growing older. So very early we lived quite close to the East Campus, and my main memories are moving around in those grounds, those beautiful grounds, in the library, which my mother would take me to, and we would look through all these wonderful books. And it was a gorgeous place, but it hadn't been very much on the West Campus because my father's Department of Mathematics at the time was on the East Campus. So as I grew older, into sort of early teens, he'd moved to the West Campus, and at that point, West Campus was like going into a fairy tale. I mean, the architecture there is so unusual. It was like books that you'd read as a small child, and suddenly, God, these places really exist. The castles and so on. It's really been quite fantastic and magical.
What was it like when you were a graduate student at Duke? What do you recall?
They had a wonderful department of psychology at that time. Really fine group of scholars and scientists who occupied, very concerned about the future of the field, what it meant to do psychology, very conscious of what it meant to do science and how that was going to be defined within the department. And Edward E. Jones, who took me on as an assistant, was at the top of his game at that time. He was sort of the star of the future of social psychology, which was going to become experimental, which was going to be all about laboratory experiments. And that's pretty much the way it is now, but he was at the turn of that, sort of working in applied sectors to turning it into an experimental discipline. And so I worked with him, and that was tremendously occupying. I mean, he was a real taskmaster, and he taught me extremely well. It was high rigor, high standards, and demand for a lot of dialogue. Why did I think that? What was that? And what did I think of this? I mean, it was a wonderful experience of education for me. So that's on the one side. I'm really trained extremely well. And the other, I have Professor Sigmund Koch. Now, Koch was an experimentalist at all. He was kind of a critic of psychology, very kind of charismatic intellectual who went on to write edit a 7-volume series on the state of psychology. So that's on the other hand, and then I could go off into sociology, which they welcomed, and I worked with Kurt Bach, who was a top-notch sociologist, and have that experience. So, and then I could take courses in philosophy. So for me, it was a wonderfully rich educational background. Really exciting time to be there.
Now, in 1973, you published what is perhaps your most influential work, an article entitled Social Psychology as History. Can you talk a little bit about the central ideas you put forth in the article and how they came about?
I was becoming more and more thoughtful about what I was doing, and began playing with some ideas at first, and my colleagues seemed to find them interesting to play with, but then I wrote them into this article, and then everything exploded. So, what was the article? Well, experimental psychology, like a lot of other sciences, prided itself on accumulating knowledge. That is, you study something to know more and more about it. So research, you search and then you go back and research so that you can accumulate knowledge over time. You can build truth. My argument was that as we studied and as we spoke about it, disseminated our ideas through journals and so on, to the public, through lectures, it had the capacity to change people's behavior. So if you study things like conformity and obedience and aggression and prejudice, it's going to call attention to what those activities. It changes the culture. And it changes it in ways that will undermine what it is you had before or make it come true, as in self-fulfilling prophecies. So it means it's not cumulative anymore. you're not getting closer and closer to the truth. What there is to be true about is undergoing continuous change. So what you're doing is history, not science.
Oh.
That was the gist of that. Well, and it was all the worse because I was a kind of a card-carrying member of the group. I mean, I grew up doing that stuff. I was a committed and rather senior for a young person. I was already on the National Science Foundation panels judging people's research proposals. And here I was in this position at Harvard saying it was all history. Finally, in this major journal, they took one article, twice as long as mine, critical, put it in the front of the journal, and declared the debate closed. That's how it got settled in psychology.